David Berkowitz had been captured, his confession was on record, and yet the story was far from over. The public had followed every detail of the investigation, but now it was time for the justice system to take its course. Berkowitz's trial would serve as a moment of reckoning not only for the families of the victims, but also for the people of New York City, who had lived in fear for more than a year. The trial would unfold with a mixture of tension, media spectacle, and unexpected twists. The trial of David Berkowitz began in June 1978, nearly a year after his arrest. It was clear from the start that this would not be a typical murder trial. The media presence was overwhelming, with television cameras and reporters swarming the courthouse. The case was a media frenzy, with the public captivated by every moment of the proceedings. The courtroom, a place of law and order, had become the stage for a spectacle that mirrored the chaos Berkowitz had instilled in the city. Berkowitz, who had once seemed cold and detached, now appeared much more subdued. He was no longer the taunting killer who had mocked police with his letters. He was a man facing the consequences of his actions. His demeanor during the trial was eerily calm, almost as if he had resigned himself to his fate. During the trial, Berkowitz's defense team put forth the argument that he was not fully responsible for his actions. His mental state, they argued, was deeply compromised. Berkowitz himself continued to claim that he had been possessed by a demon named Sam, who had ordered him to kill. However, the defense's attempt to use mental illness as an excuse for the killings was met with skepticism. In the eyes of the public and the court, Berkowitz's crimes were too deliberate, too cold-blooded, to be dismissed as the result of mere mental illness. His detailed planning and calculated actions in each of the murders made it difficult for anyone to believe he had been completely out of control. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney William L. Morris, presented a powerful case that painted Berkowitz as a cold-blooded killer who had acted with full awareness of his actions. The prosecution emphasized the brutality of the murders and the methodical nature of Berkowitz's attacks. They argued that Berkowitz had not acted out of impulse or under the influence of mental illness, but rather had committed the murders for his own pleasure and sense of power. The prosecution's case focused on the evidence that had been gathered during the investigation. The bullets found at each of the crime scenes matched Berkowitz's .44 caliber revolver, and the eyewitness testimony corroborated the timeline of events leading up to his arrest. Berkowitz's letters to the media were also used as a key piece of evidence, illustrating his taunting and manipulative behavior. These letters were read aloud in court, sending shivers through the courtroom as they exposed Berkowitz's twisted mindset. But the prosecution's strongest argument was the simple fact that Berkowitz had planned the murders. He had stalked his victims, carefully chosen his locations, and followed a consistent pattern with each attack. This, the prosecution argued, was not the act of a man driven by insanity, but of a man who had exercised his free will to commit murder. As the trial progressed, the media coverage intensified. Television broadcasts of the trial brought the case into the homes of millions of Americans, turning it into a nationwide spectacle. News outlets reported every development, from the courtroom exchanges to the reactions of Berkowitz's victims' families. The media's role in the trial was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, the media coverage brought much-needed attention to the families of the victims, giving them a platform to express their grief and demand justice. But, on the other hand, the media's sensationalistic approach to the trial turned it into a circus. The public was more interested in the drama of the case than the actual facts, and many people were more captivated by the idea of Berkowitz as a villain than by the real human cost of his actions. As Berkowitz sat in the courtroom, the media continued to dissect his every move. The public's obsession with his persona grew, and many began to view the trial as less about justice and more about entertainment. The line between reality and spectacle became increasingly blurred after weeks of testimony and deliberation. The jury reached a verdict. On June 12, 1978, David Berkowitz was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and several counts of attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life for each murder, to be served consecutively. Berkowitz's reaction to the verdict was calm and emotionless. He had expected the outcome, and he had prepared himself for a lifetime in prison. For the families of the victims, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but it did little to ease their pain. The trial had been an ordeal, a painful reminder of the loved ones they had lost. For New Yorkers, the trial was a long-awaited resolution to a year of terror, but the psychological scars of the son of Sam killings would linger for years to come. Even after the trial, Berkowitz remained a fixture in the public consciousness. His story, full of mystery and madness, continued to captivate the public. The media, ever hungry for new angles, began to speculate about Berkowitz's life in prison and his evolving narrative. Berkowitz himself continued to play into the media's obsession with him. He gave multiple interviews over the years, often changing his story and providing new details about his life and crimes. Some experts believed that Berkowitz was simply enjoying the attention, using the media to keep himself relevant even after his conviction. Others wondered if he was trying to reinvent himself, to explain his actions in a way that would allow him to make sense of the chaos he had created. The media's obsession with Berkowitz reached a point where it overshadowed the real tragedy of the case, the 6 innocent lives that had been taken. But in the eyes of the public, Berkowitz had become a symbol of something larger. He was the manifestation of fear of the unknown, of the darkness lurking within the human soul. As Berkowitz's trial came to an end, the question of his true motivations remained unresolved. Was he truly influenced by a demon named Sam, or was he simply a man with a twisted mind who used his mental illness as an excuse? What role did his upbringing, his isolation, and his troubled past play in shaping the killer he became? And perhaps most chillingly, could Berkowitz have been stopped earlier? Or was this tragedy inevitable from the moment he set foot in New York? David Berkowitz's trial and conviction brought a certain level of closure to the son of Sam case. However, the story of his crimes, the twisted mindset that led him to murder, and the public fascination with his persona didn't end when the gavel fell. As Berkowitz entered the prison system, a new chapter in the saga began, one that would continue to captivate the public, as well as psychological and criminological experts. Over the years, his prison interviews and letters would add even more layers of mystery to an already chilling tale. When Berkowitz was first sentenced to prison in 1978, the media frenzy surrounding his arrest had largely settled. He was now behind bars, serving time for 6 brutal murders. But while the public's obsession with him waned, his story didn't quite disappear. It was in the confines of the prison walls where Berkowitz would begin his long journey of reflection, self-examination, and perhaps most notably, reinvention. In the early years of his incarceration, Berkowitz seemed to be just another prisoner, serving his time quietly. The media and the public had little interest in his day-to-day life. But as years went by, something shifted within Berkowitz. He began to transform from the angry, paranoid killer of the son of Sam to someone who expressed deep remorse and sought redemption. It wasn't long before he began to speak openly about his crimes. However, the narrative he spun was ever-changing. He repeatedly said that he had found God and, as part of his newfound Christian faith, felt guilt and shame for his actions. He began to distance himself from the son of Sam persona, describing it as an alter ego that had taken control of him. Berkowitz's conversion to Christianity became a central theme of his prison years. He began to associate himself with evangelical Christian groups, claiming that his faith had given him the strength to confront his past and seek forgiveness for his heinous crimes. He frequently wrote letters to religious leaders, expressing his newfound beliefs and remorse. Some even referred to him as Son of Hope, as he claimed to have found peace through his relationship with God, but many people remained skeptical. Was this a genuine transformation, or was Berkowitz simply manipulating the public's desire for a story of redemption? Could a man who had been so cold and calculating in his killings truly change? And more troublingly, did this newfound faith absolve him of the terrible things he had done? In interviews with journalists, Berkowitz seemed to embody the classic narrative of a reformed criminal. He claimed that he was no longer the same person, that the man who committed those murders was gone. But his behavior didn't always align with his words. He continued to express fascination with his past crimes, often contradicting himself and implying that there were still parts of his story that hadn't been fully told. Berkowitz's writings and statements became increasingly erratic. In some letters, he talked about the voices that had guided him during his killing spree, while in others, he emphasized his Christian faith. This tug-of-war between his past and present selves added complexity to an already complex case. Was he truly remorseful, or was he attempting to deflect blame onto an alter ego and outside influences? Even in the prison system, the myth of Sam persisted. Berkowitz's stories about the demon dog, Harvey, and the dark voice that had supposedly controlled him continue to surface in his letters. For a long time, Berkowitz seemed to cling to the idea that he was not fully responsible for his actions, that some external force had driven him to kill. But as time went on, he began to backpedal on these claims, often contradicting himself in various interviews. In 1987, Berkowitz gave an interview in which he said that the demon Sam was a figment of his imagination, a product of his paranoia and mental illness. He expressed regret for ever using it as an excuse for his actions. This admission only further complicated the public's perception of Berkowitz. Was he now lying about his past? Or was this finally the truth? Was he simply seeking a new narrative to distance himself from the monster he had become? Or was he genuinely confronting the darkness within himself? Some psychologists who studied Berkowitz concluded that his obsession with Sam was a mechanism for coping with his guilt. By externalizing his violence and blaming a demon, he could avoid facing the full extent of his culpability. Others believed that Berkowitz had genuinely been influenced by some form of delusion or psychosis. Although there was no conclusive evidence to support this theory, despite his seemingly sincere transformation, Berkowitz remained a subject of fascination for the media. Prison interviews continued throughout the years, with journalists eager to speak to the man who had terrorized New York City. Berkowitz's answers were often vague and contradictory, but one thing remained constant: the desire to explain himself. In 1996, Berkowitz gave an interview in which he acknowledged the full scope of his crimes, offering apologies to the families of the victims. He spoke about how he had used his faith to cope with his guilt, but his tone suggested that he was still working through unresolved emotions. His comments about the murders often came across as detached, almost as though he was describing someone else's actions rather than his own. This dissonance between his words and his apparent lack of true remorse troubled many over the years. Berkowitz's claims about his mental state, his faith, and his past grew increasingly complex. Some believed he had never fully confronted the reality of his crimes, while others saw his changing story as proof of his guilt. In the end, the true nature of David Berkowitz remained elusive, and his story continued to captivate the public. Even decades after the murders, even after all these years, the legacy of the Son of Sam killings remains a potent force in both the criminal justice system and popular culture. The case set a chilling precedent for the fear and fascination that would accompany high-profile serial killers in the decades to come. Berkowitz's story also left a lasting mark on the families of the victims, who would never be able to fully move on from the trauma he inflicted. New York City, forever changed by the Son of Sam murders, would continue to grapple with the impact of the killings for years to come. The case served as a stark reminder of the terror that can lurk in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. It also raised questions about the nature of evil, mental illness, and the potential for rehabilitation. That perhaps the most haunting question that still lingers, even after Berkowitz's conviction and decades of reflection, is this: could it have been prevented? Could someone have seen the signs earlier? Could David Berkowitz's descent into violence have been halted before it reached its terrifying peak? As Berkowitz continues his life in prison, the question of his true motivations still haunts the public. Was he a man manipulated by demons? Or was he simply a murderer hiding behind delusions? What pieces of the puzzle still remain? And what truth is still hidden within the shadows of his mind? David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, had been sentenced to life in prison, but the public's fascination with him didn't end there. Over the years, the Son of Sam case evolved from a horrific crime spree to a symbol of terror, a haunting chapter in New York's criminal history, and a larger-than-life figure in the annals of true crime. The media, public perception, and Berkowitz's own attempts to navigate his past created a strange and ongoing relationship with the cultural landscape, one that would endure long after the victims were gone and the killer was imprisoned. While Berkowitz may have been behind bars, his story had taken on a life of its own. Media outlets, fascinated by his twisted narrative, continued to cover him, even in the years following his arrest. His letters, court appearances, and prison interviews became the stuff of public consumption. Berkowitz himself, despite being in prison, became a fixture in media coverage. Documentaries, books, interviews, and articles all focused on him, each piece of content asking the same haunting question: what drove a seemingly ordinary man to commit such unspeakable acts? True crime enthusiasts, psychologists, criminologists, and the public at large were captivated by the mystery of Berkowitz. The criminal's shift from being a remorseless killer to a man of faith sparked debates about redemption, the power of the human psyche, and whether or not someone like Berkowitz could ever truly rehabilitate. People were drawn to the contradictions in his story. How could someone who committed such horrific crimes claim to have found God? Was he genuinely remorseful, or was it simply a tactic to gain sympathy? Was the man who once taunted police with his letters now seeking atonement? The case's public appeal was not just based on Berkowitz's actions, but also on the questions he raised about the nature of evil, insanity, and human nature. The line between the real events and the media spectacle blurred, as Berkowitz's story became almost mythological in the eyes of the public. In the years following Berkowitz's trial, he became an unintentional cultural icon. His crimes, his mysterious letters, and his bizarre claims about demons and voices made him a prime subject for the growing genre of true crime. While serial killers like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy had captured the public's imagination, Berkowitz's combination of sensationalism, fear, and psychological complexity made him an enduring figure in the media. His case gave rise to a new kind of media fascination, the cultural obsession with the psychology of the killer. Berkowitz's admission of guilt, followed by his fluctuating stories, provided a never-ending supply of questions and mystery for those who followed his case. The idea that a seemingly ordinary person could suddenly unleash a wave of senseless violence struck a chord with the public's desire to understand the darkest corners of the human mind. Berkowitz wasn't just a killer, he became an enigma. His story would go on to influence countless documentaries, books, and even pop culture references, cementing his status as a notorious figure. Television shows, podcasts, and true crime books all made Berkowitz a subject of interest, rehashing the details of his crimes and speculating about his psychological state. Even in prison, Berkowitz continued to manipulate the public narrative. His letters, sometimes coherent, other times rambling, became part of the ongoing fascination with the case. Prison interviews, in which he claimed to have found faith, provided more layers to his already complex persona. These interviews were often filled with conflicting statements. At times, Berkowitz expressed genuine remorse for his actions. At other times, he seemed to revel in the notoriety his case had brought him. In his letters, Berkowitz often referred to himself as a monster, a term that became synonymous with his name. But despite his self-deprecation, there was a sense of self-awareness in his words, as if he understood his role as both a villain and a symbol of something larger. Many believed his true nature was still hidden behind his new faith and the media's portrayal of him. Was he genuinely reformed, or was he still playing a part? His interviews also made him a more sympathetic figure, and this complicated the public's view of him. Berkowitz's prison statements were sometimes filled with remorse and guilt, but other times they seemed almost like a calculated attempt to gain redemption or avoid further punishment. People wondered if he was still the same man who had once terrorized New York City, or if he had truly undergone a transformation. Berkowitz's words continue to stir debate, contributing to the ongoing intrigue and confusion surrounding his actions. One of the more persistent theories that surrounded the Son of Sam killings was whether David Berkowitz had acted alone. In the years after his conviction, various rumors and theories emerged suggesting that Berkowitz was not the only person involved in the murders. Some believed that he was part of a cult, or that there were accomplices who helped him carry out the killings. These theories were fueled by Berkowitz's own statements, in which he seemed to imply that he was not entirely responsible for his actions. Berkowitz's claims that he was under the influence of the demon Sam raised further questions. Some speculated that the killings were not the result of a single individual, but part of a larger, more sinister conspiracy. The media, eager for new angles and narratives, latched onto these theories, further cementing Berkowitz's place in popular culture. But despite Berkowitz's claims and the conspiracy theories, there was never any concrete evidence to support the idea that he had accomplices. In fact, Berkowitz's conviction and confession seemed to suggest that he was acting alone. Nonetheless, the idea of a larger conspiracy persisted, and it became part of the enduring legacy of the Son of Sam case. The case of the Son of Sam helped to shape the true crime genre as we know it today. While serial killer cases had always fascinated the public, the Son of Sam killings were among the first to capture the kind of widespread media attention that serial killers like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer would later enjoy. Berkowitz's crimes, his letters, and his eventual transformation into a media icon were all part of the cultural shift towards a more intense and personal form of true crime storytelling. As true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books exploded in popularity, the legacy of the Son of Sam killings continued to haunt modern storytelling. Berkowitz's case became a touchstone in the genre, setting the stage for the media's intense focus on serial killers and the psychological profiling of criminals. The idea that understanding the mind of a killer could lead to solving future crimes became a focal point for law enforcement and the public alike. Berkowitz's ability to evade capture for so long, and the seemingly random nature of his attacks, made him a unique case in the world of criminal investigation. He wasn't just a killer, he was a symbol of the fear and paranoia that could take hold of an entire city, a symbol that continues to shape how we view crime, punishment, and media culture today. David Berkowitz's story is not just one of a killer's reign of terror, it is a reflection of the public's fascination with crime, punishment, and the complexities of the human mind. His transformation from a murderer to a self-professed man of faith raises uncomfortable questions about redemption and the capacity for change. As we continue to explore his legacy, we must ask ourselves, was Berkowitz's eventual remorse genuine? Or was it simply another piece of his complex story? Stay tuned, subscribe, like, share, and leave review in the comment below.